and welcome to everyone joining us today for Build Back Feminist, a celebration for International Women's Day organised by the High Commission of Canada in the UK. I'm your MC and moderator, Polly Russell from the Eccles Centre for North American Studies at the British Library and the lead curator for the British Library's current exhibition, Unfinished Business, The Fight for Women's Rights, and I am delighted to have you with us. We've heard a lot about building back better post-COVID-19, but in order to build back better, we have to build back feminist. That means taking an inclusive approach to COVID-19 recovery, an approach that listens to diverse experiences, people and ideas. So buckle up and get ready to hear from some of Canada's most inspiring female leaders as we uncover pathways to post-COVID equality Canada style. Opening today's event is none other than Her Excellency Janice Charette, High Commissioner for Canada in the UK. From leading Canada's federal public service to being named one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women, Mrs. Charette is a distinguished leader in Canada's public service, a dedicated representative of Canada abroad, and a proud advocate for mental health and well-being in the workplace. Mrs. Charette, over to you.
Thank you, Polly. And let me say first how grateful we are that you accepted our invitation to be our MC and moderator today. It's always a pleasure to work with you and to collaborate with your team from the Eccles Centre at the British Library. Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue, welcome, and of course, happy International Women's Day. Every year, this occasion provides us an opportunity to celebrate inspiring women changing the world for the better. Chaque année, cette occasion est une opportunité de célébrer les femmes inspirantes qui changent le monde pour le mieux. Of course, things are a little bit different this year. As we aren't able to open the doors of Canada House and welcome you all to an in-person event, we carried on with our digital by default approach to present this online event. There is a silver lining to all of this. We are together virtually from all corners of the world. So whether you're watching from the United Kingdom, from Canada, or from one of the more than 30 countries where viewers are registered to be able to participate and attend, we are very excited to have you with us for today's program. We've gathered an outstanding group of influential Canadian women to discuss this central idea. To build back better post-COVID, we must build back feminist. I look forward to hearing from all of them in a moment. But first, some reflections on the theme of this event. The pandemic has exacerbated existing inequalities and further exposed vulnerabilities in health, socioeconomic, and political systems. It's also shone a light on existing injustices in our societies. New data from UN Women suggests that the pandemic could wipe out 25 years of improving gender equality. Employment and education opportunities could be lost, and women may suffer from poor mental and physical health in the long term because of the consequences of the pandemic. The impacts of COVID-19 on gender equality can be felt in all spheres. For example, women are at increased risk of exposure to the virus, given that they make up nearly 70% of frontline healthcare workers, carers at home, and community leaders and mobilizers. The food and nutrition crisis that's emerging in the wake of COVID-19 response measures will disproportionately affect women and girls who are already at heightened risk of food insecurity and malnutrition and comprise 60% of the world's chronically hungry. Compounded economic impacts are especially felt by women, girls, and marginalized groups who generally earn less, save less, and hold insecure jobs or live close to poverty. Unpaid care work, the bulk of which is done by women, has increased, with children being out of school, heightened care needs of older persons, and overwhelmed health services. Globally, on average, women may also be more impacted by the economic disruptions and related impacts caused by COVID-19 mitigation measures because they disproportionately work in insecure labor. Self-isolation, working from home, and lockdowns have increased the risk of domestic abuse, particularly for women. Some domestic abuse charities have seen an over 60% increase in contact made to their helplines and centers. The economic impact of the pandemic has forced many children to abandon their studies in favor of work, or for many girls, early marriage. Studies actually suggest that in the next decade, 13 million child marriages that would have been averted may go ahead due to the pandemic. And finally, low-income women who work are more likely to be especially affected by a slowdown in discretionary consumption demand, as they tend to be employed in hospitality, retail, or other service industries. But women are not just victims of the COVID-19 pandemic. They also play a major role in the current response globally, given their role as frontline health workers and community workers. It's therefore crucial that women be included in all response and recovery decisions, and that their rights, their needs, their experiences, and their leadership be fully considered. More broadly, the integration of gender equality considerations in global health emergencies and economic crises requires a conscious effort on the part of national governments, and there's an opportunity in this crisis to elevate the importance of doing so. Now, conversations around the climate emergency, around childhood poverty, anti-racism, women's rights have all entered the mainstream. There's an emerging sense that change is possible, and that rather than trying to emerge from the pandemic to reestablish the status quo, we can aim higher and rebuild our societies along more sustainable and equitable lines. Canada believes that success is achieved when all people enjoy the same human rights and opportunities to succeed, when everyone can fully benefit from equal participation in economic, political, social, and cultural life, regardless of their gender. Le Canada croit que le succès est lorsque tous et tous bénéficient des mêmes droits de la personne et des mêmes chances de réussir. Gender equality benefits everyone and leads to greater health, happiness, and prosperity for all. And that is why Canada is such a strong voice for gender equality, both at home and abroad, championing gender equality and women and girls empowerment wherever we have a seat at the table, including at the G7, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and COP26. The UK is hosting the G7 and COP26 this year, and we are looking forward to working with our close ally and partner to put gender equality at the heart of global efforts to build back better from the pandemic and to addressing climate change. We all need to do our part, and I'd like to take this moment to invite you, everyone in our audience, to commit to building back feminist in your own way, and to share your thoughts publicly during and after this event with the hashtag #BuildBackFeminist. Now, let's hear what our speakers have to say about it. I am delighted that in the current world of online events, the physical distance between Canada and the United Kingdom was no barrier to bringing together powerful Canadian voices, such as the Honorable Dr. Jean Augustine, Maryam and Nivaal Rehman, Carolyn Wilkins, and my interview with Margaret Atwood also promises to be thought-provoking. And I urge you to watch until the very end so that you don't miss a beautiful musical performance by Shawnee. Shawnee's the first Indigenous artist to take home the #1 spot on the CBC Searchlight Contest in 2020. So please enjoy the program. I'm going to come back a bit later to introduce our guest of honor, the Honorable Karina Gould, Canada's Minister of International Development. But for now, back to you, Polly.
Wow, that summary of how the pandemic has impacted disproportionately on women across the globe is sobering and a reminder of why building back must have women at its core. Luckily today, we are going to hear from some amazing women from a range of different sectors, but who have all got brilliant ideas about what a feminist future looks like. Our first speaker has spent 20 years working on some of the most pressing economic issues in Canada and has most recently helped define Canada's monetary and economic policy in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I just can't think of a better person than Carolyn Wilkins, formerly the most senior woman in the Bank of Canada, to shine a light on why a feminist approach to economic recovery is essential to bouncing back from the coronavirus crisis.
Hello, it's such a pleasure to be part of the High Commission of Canada's celebration of International Women's Day. Well, here we are, it's March the 3rd, and it's almost exactly 1 year since the World Health Organization declared the global pandemic. And over that year, we've been painfully aware of the lives that have been lost or sideswiped. It's been our neighbors, our families, our friends. I think it's fair to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has left very few untouched in one way or another. Yet there's no escaping the fact that the fallout has hit certain groups of people harder. Old people, people who live alone, frontline workers like nurses and doctors, and people who work in grocery stores. When it comes to livelihoods, the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on women and the more vulnerable groups in our society. The numbers, they really speak for themselves. At the global level, women make up just under 40% of employment, but they've accounted for over 50% of overall job losses during the pandemic. That's pretty distressing, but it's not surprising. Women are more likely to work in high contact services like restaurants and retail stores. And these are the jobs that have been severely impacted by social distancing measures. And with many schools and daycares closed or on reduced hours, it's been really challenging for primary caregivers, usually women, to get back to work. Now, the UK and Canada are no different. The sectors that have been hit the hardest are still struggling under the containment measures. And it's not just about women. I don't want to give that impression. Young people, recent immigrants, and racialized groups have been particularly hard hit too. So, what can we do to navigate this? Well, clearly, we need to prioritize the protection of public health. So, rapid testing and vaccinations are table stakes for getting the economy back on track. We also need to bridge the income losses that people are experiencing. That's what our governments are doing right now. But we mustn't lose sight of the scarring effects of the pandemic and do everything that we can to avoid them. To be frank, I think without the right policy choices, the progress that we've made for women and marginalized groups could be set back decades. And the scarring could show up in wider pay gaps or more people dropping out of the workforce altogether. There's a few reasons for that. And the first is that many businesses and high contact services may never reopen. Women entrepreneurs tend to be more concentrated in these sectors than male entrepreneurs. Another reason is that childcare services have struggled during COVID, and it's going to take a while for them to get back on track. It's going to be pretty challenging for women to progress in their career if they have to work part time or stay home. COVID has also only accelerated digitalization of the economy. I see an increased push to increase efficiency by adopting new technologies. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one who's buying more things online. Now, this won't mean fewer jobs overall, but it will mean that jobs will require different skills. And studies show that women and vulnerable groups will find it harder to adapt. So, governments and the private sector absolutely need to address the profoundly uneven ways in which different communities will experience life after COVID. Well, how can we do this? First thing is to seize the opportunities that are right in front of us to build a better economy. Top of my list are private and public investments in technology and in a lower carbon economy in which we can all benefit. Just imagine if digitalization and climate change became sources of shared prosperity and not sources of anxiety. Education and training. Imagine if more girls and women studied economics, science, engineering, so that they could drive the new economy. Well, better childcare. I saw a report that found that fathers in the UK were spending twice as much time caring for their children than they were at the start of the crisis. Well, imagine if we could build on this so that both parents could share more evenly the joy of raising their families. The second thing we could do is make sure more women are at the table to set the strategic direction for policies for the future. The research is pretty clear that companies do better when there is more gender balance in management and in board leadership. Now, I know from my experience as Senior Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada that policy discussions are richer when there is diversity at the table. And it's not just gender, it's also cultural background, work experience. I also know it's not enough to just talk about diversity. We need our public and private institutions to show leadership, and many, including the Bank of Canada, have set objectives for diversity that they're willing to be accountable for. That's a good thing. We all need to care about this. Inequality makes economies less vibrant and less resilient. And more importantly, it threatens the core values of the open societies we are fortunate enough to live in: democracy, free markets that deliver. Our collective success will need bold public and private policy actions that focus on long-run prosperity that is shared. And this will not happen without women.
I take 2 key points from Carolyn's brilliant talk. Any progress women have made over the last decades, which has not been perfect but has happened in places, is fundamentally threatened by the impact of this pandemic. But this moment gives us a chance to rethink and reset how we deal with major challenges like climate change, education and training, and ensure that women are part of the solution. Now, next we have 2 inspiring young women joining us. Maryam and Nivaal Rehman are the Pakistani-Canadian twin activist duo behind the non-profit The World with MNR, advocating for gender equality, inclusivity and climate justice. From interviews with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Malala to the stage of the 2018 G7 summit, these young women know what it means to make sure the marginalised are heard on the world stage. And today they're joining us right here for Build Back Feminist to look at the important role of girls' education in post-COVID recovery.
Hi everyone, my name is Maryam.
And my name is Nivaal, and we are so honored to be with all of you today. We're twin activists, journalists, and also the co-founders of The World with MNR, our nonprofit which uses advocacy, storytelling, and development to take action for gender equality, climate justice, and inclusivity. As the COVID-19 pandemic hit all of us last year, it seemed as if the whole world was put on a pause. However, a lot of issues like gender inequalities actually persisted and were even exacerbated during this time. For example, with gender-based violence, or what is now known as the shadow pandemic, a lot of people who were staying at home were actually more vulnerable to these issues because of the fact that they were in lockdown. And as well, at its peak, the pandemic actually caused more than 767 million girls to be out of school, according to reports by UNESCO. Child marriage was also increased considerably because a lot of girls who were staying at home were forced into early marriages, and there was a lack of intervention possible from members of the community or teachers in these cases because of the lockdowns and from them not being able to leave their homes. Although it was a significant shift from what we were used to, we focused on using digital advocacy and activism during this time to ensure that progress on gender equality continued. Most of our work used to be in person. It used to be oriented around grassroots work and hosting events and dialogues and discussions with community members as well, but obviously that wasn't possible in the same way during the pandemic, but it offered us an opportunity to be able to start using digital tools in an effective manner to be able to still make an impact. A lot of the things that we did last year were oriented around connecting with youth, and in this way we were able to find solutions and exchange ideas from around the world and be able to come up with better solutions for addressing the increased challenges presented by COVID-19. We also held dialogues with organizations like the UN Girls Education Initiative and their partners, including the Global Partnership for Education, whereby we were able to have intergenerational dialogues between policy leaders and youth activists as well, and again facilitate this exchange of ideas whereby we were able to come up with better solutions for addressing COVID-19. Needless to say, we learned a lot during this time, and we were able to come up with better ways and gain key insights into building a feminist recovery from COVID-19. And as we work towards this feminist recovery, we think that the most important thing that we can do is using intersectional and gendered approaches in both our government plans as well as policies as we come out of the pandemic. This is incredibly important in combination with systemic and structural changes. We know that this is an ambitious ask of government governments. However, we believe that it is possible. And COVID-19 has actually shown us that immediate as well as radical shifts in policies are actually possible, especially when there are urgent issues that governments are facing. And gender inequalities are very urgent, and they're connected and interconnected with a lot of the other goals that we have as a society, whether that is related to healthcare or climate change. And we believe that when we are taking action for gender equality, then we are able to address all of these other issues as well. One of the first things that governments can do is investing in girls' education. This is because girls are the ones who are going to be leading our world in the future, and we hope that we can equip them with the tools that they need to take action, and an education can ensure that. And so we urge all governments to not only take action for girls' education in their own countries, but also countries around the world through supporting initiatives like the Global Partnership for Education. In addition, it's important to include the perspectives of youth and women from Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC communities, and ensure that recovery plans are implemented in partnership with them so that we can reimagine and recreate possibilities for improving our world post-COVID-19. A lot of structural barriers seek to disadvantage a lot of these communities, and often solutions for gender equality are led by a select few people, and so the solutions have not been intersectional or not been enough to cover the varying degrees of challenges that face communities like BIPOC communities. And so it is important to include them in the process because they are the experts in their lived experiences, and also because they can offer new solutions for addressing long-standing issues like gender equality. We also think it's essential for governments to take a holistic approach when supporting women and girls, and this can be done through investments in their voices, well-being, as well as participation in society. We believe that when women face different challenges, they are not faced individually of each other, and so if a girl is facing a health crisis, that will also affect her participation in society through education. And so we believe that if governments are able to take action and support women's health, and as well as like their well-being and their participation in all of these different aspects of their identities, then they will be able to support them in a much more meaningful way and take a lasting and make a lasting change as well. And so we encourage all governments to be investing in women in this way and through this holistic approach, so that we are able to have a strong economic as well as social recovery from COVID-19. There's clearly a lot of work to be done, and through collaboration, the right commitments, and implementation of recovery plans, the world can be in a better, more inclusive, and stronger place than we found it. Thank you so much for your time.
Maryam and Nivaal really remind us that the future is at stake at this critical moment for the world, and that solutions will only be found if we invite diverse voices to be part of the conversation. Now, what can I say about our next speaker? She is a force to be reckoned with. She's a single mum, Canadian immigrant, former educator, and in 1993 was elected as Canada's first Black female parliamentarian, leading a phenomenally feminist career in Canadian government for 13 years. She championed motions to create Black History Month in Canada and to erect a statue of Canada's famous 5 on Parliament Hill. She is a community leader and a woman who walks the walk. This is the Honourable Dr. Jean Augustine to talk to us about the importance of feminist leadership in building back better post-COVID.
My history of activism and advocacy can be described as focused on 2 intertwined goals: building a better Canada and a better world, an inclusive world. Feminist leadership is at the heart of my quest and Canada's quest for equality and equity for all people. Feminist leadership involves a shared pursuit of social, political, legal, economic, and cultural equality. It involves equal access to power, authority, and resources, dismantling those systemic barriers that prevent women's equality, and deconstructing the roots of inequalities and injustices to work towards a more just, inclusive, fair, equitable, and compassionate society. Yes, there has been progress in women's leadership over the last several decades. Indeed, Women now serve as heads of state or government in 21 countries. But the other side of the coin is that 119 countries have never had a woman leader. If we dive even deeper, we know that around the world, the reality remains that traditional gender roles and deeper structural inequalities continue to place women at a disadvantage relative to men in all spheres of endeavor. As a matter of fact, women can constitute the majority among 1 billion people living in extreme poverty. So what is this inclusive society we all seek? An inclusive society does not discriminate on any basis. It is one that is based on respect for all human rights and fundamental freedoms, cultural and religious diversity, social justice, and the special needs of vulnerable and disadvantaged groups, democratic participation, and the rule of law. This requires that the voices of all members of society and their needs and concerns be heard. Feminist leadership ensures that in building an inclusive society, members not only have the right to education and political participation, they must take part in the process. This is what yields results. Intersectionality is always relevant here. For me, there are a few: Anglophone, Catholic, senior, Black woman, immigrant woman. It is on that basis that I've had to combat discrimination and prejudice, systemic racism, marginalization, and social inclusion. The activism and advocacy of women over the past 50 years has seen much robust legislation to try to address this. As a matter of fact, Canada demonstrates true leadership in this area with a forceful collection of social inclusion laws and policies. But while legislative initiatives are fundamental steps to take, they do not change relations of power because implementation is frequently obstructed by entrenched structures and values. Instead, feminist leadership in building an inclusive society involves transforming the mindset of people, challenging unequal power relations, advocating for ways to ensure that everyone is represented at those decision-making tables that define the culture, the values, the standards of the society. With new technology offering new vistas in education, dialogue, and public awareness campaigns, we must recognize that education plays a critical role, especially for young people. For all of us, it fills the knowledge gaps, addressing the patterns of exclusion in educational curricula, including the absence of important content. Effective leadership is also crucial. To invite participation, the leadership must be prepared not only to listen, but to respond. Governance and policymaking processes need to become more transparent and inclusive in their functioning. Policy must be tailored and rewritten to reflect the needs and concerns of a diverse population. Building societies that are more inclusive and fighting gender discrimination is up to all of us. It is essential to making our world a better, safer place for everyone. We all have a role to play towards our best future. Thank you.
How incredibly inspiring, and an important reminder that a feminist future is not just about improving women's and girls' lives, it's about creating an inclusive society which raises everyone up. Now, earlier today, High Commissioner Charette sat down with a woman who truly needs no introduction. The author of over 50 books of fiction, poetry, critical essays, and graphic novels, including her most recent, Dearly and The Testaments, this is Margaret Atwood on Building Back Feminist, listening to diverse voices and the impact of health and climate crisis on women and girls.
Well, a special welcome to our guest as part of the Canada House International Women's Day event. My great pleasure to welcome Margaret Atwood for a conversation under our theme about building back feminist. So welcome to you, Margaret.
And it's lovely to be there with you for Canada House, which is where I used to pick up my mail. The first time I went to England in 1963, all of the Canadians could go to Canada House and pick up their mail. Remember mail?
I do remember that,
envelope,
yes.
you had stamps. So that's what we did. And you could also go there and see if there were any rooms for rent.
Wow.
Rooms for rent postings, which is how I ended up in Willesden Green.
Oh, yes.
Yes, but then I got rescued by somebody who had a flat share in South Kensington.
Ooh, that's a nice neighborhood.
Oh, I wasn't actually supposed to be there. I got smuggled in.
So, Margaret, let me ask you a question around this theme of build back better, because throughout the pandemic so far, we've been hearing the idea of kind of using the post-pandemic period as an opportunity to build back better. And so the Canadian government has talked about building back better in a way that's more inclusive and more sustainable. And so for today's event, we're talking about Build Back Feminist as one of Canada's most influential authors and leading advocate for women globally, somebody who we all look up to and admire so greatly. What does Building Back Feminist mean to you?
Well, let's flip the question around a bit. So women are half the human race. So that means they're half of all the good things the human race does, but they're also part of all the bad things the human race does. And the climate change crisis that we find ourselves in is therefore women's responsibility too. So building back with women included in the equation would also mean giving them more responsibility. So more agency, because actually women are a big key to fixing the climate crisis. And one of the reasons that they're a big key is that in a lot of countries, they are key to agriculture, but they're also key to what consumers buy. So giving women more agency, giving them more responsibility, giving them more education, which is very important, is going to be a big part of building back better. And in a lot of traditional communities, women did have that agency. So it basically from the modern era on, it got, actually if you go back to the early Bronze Age, you can see it being removed. But it was there and could be there again. And you have seen many countries returning to a point where women had a lot more agency in the past. So that would be one way of looking at it. It's not just a question of other people giving women stuff. It's women saying what it is that they need to have more agency, take more responsibility, and make more decisions.
And as you say, be educated in a way that actually allows them to take...
giving them the education that they need.
Mm. Well, I think that actually takes me nicely to my next question for you, because, you know, you've talked a lot about the plurality of Canadian society and the richness of our society. And I know you recently interviewed His Royal Highness Prince Charles, and you both talked about how important it was to listen to Indigenous and First Nations leaders when it comes to issues around the environment, climate change, sustainability. And so why tell us why you think it's important to be able to bring those different voices to the table for these discussions while we're working on tackling the climate crisis and aiming for a green recovery in the aftermath of this terrible pandemic?
Yeah, so this is a question around the world. It's not just a Canadian question. It's not just a North American question. It's around the world. So people who live on the land and who have been living on the land for a very long
Forever.
time are best positioned to tell you about that land, what's going on with that land. Again, ask those people what they think should be done to improve the land that they know so well. So one of my examples that I use is the National Maasai Conservancy, who have flipped the model of how you do wildlife conservation. And they've made a great success of it. And they've made a great success of it because they know that land. And one thing that they did was they took down fences and let the animals vote with their feet. So unless you make it worthwhile for people on the land to benefit from what is happening with that land, it's not going to happen. And you can say that about any place in the world.
So it's also the case that they pick it up. They are, because they're so close to the land, they also are more sensitive and more aware of the changes that these conditions are bringing.
Yes, but and that's a big piece. So it's information. But again, unless you make it beneficial for those people to use that information, it won't happen, because why should it?
So beneficial in what way? Tell me what.
Well, they have to be able to profit from it.
So an economic opportunity out of it.
Yeah, improve their lifestyle. And with the National Maasai Conservancy, because they had a strong community, because they had already seen the benefits, they were able to become the food distributors during COVID. So listening to the people on the ground, and that is how BirdLife International, with which I'm also connected, that's how they work. They're a grassroots up, ground up organization that listens to what the national organizations tell them they need. So it's not somebody coming in from outside and saying, you need this.
Right.
It's people there saying, this is what we need.
Local wisdom, local knowledge, really.
Local wisdom,
drives it.
Knowledge, and awareness of people's needs, what is needed.
Let me go to my last question for you then. And it goes back to the focus again around women and girls in particular, because I think we are seeing both the COVID crisis, the pandemic, as well as the climate crisis are having a disproportionate impact on women and girls. And I know two of your more famous books that are well known here, the Testaments, and of course the Handmaid's Tale, the predecessor to that. The reality of disproportionate impact on women and girls is a pretty core part of the thesis there. How do you think we could, or how could we help women and girls to protect themselves, or how can we help to protect women and girls from some of these impacts?
So what you're talking about is domestic violence. And you're seeing more of it because people are cooped up because of COVID. They can't, they don't have escape routes. And of course, when there's more stress in a society, whether it be from a pandemic or whether it be from financial crash or civil war, whatever, if people are feeling very frustrated, angry, and anxious, they're likely to take it out on their on those that they can get their hands on, namely their household. So it's not a woman and girl problem. It's a problem for women and girls, but it is not a problem being created by them. So probably you should think about how to take the stress off households where there is a huge amount of stress because of job loss, because of being cooped up, no escape route. I don't have the answers for this, and I'm not sure that anybody does, but I think you have to look at the total picture. So if your choice is having a roof over your head and getting beaten up and not having a roof over your head, what would you pick? That is the problem. It is two bad choices. So what would a good choice look like? And what would assistance look like? And assistance would probably look like, number one, a safe place to go. But it would probably also look like, what's the total picture? Like, what other human beings are being stressed and impacted here?
It's also the case where we're seeing women and girls, women in particular, who tend to be in the occupations where you can't transition very easily to the work from home model. You know, they're in service jobs.
Exactly. They've lost a lot of jobs.
They're on these frontline worker jobs. These are the folks that are continuing to have to go to work every day, or alternatively,
or they lose their jobs. Yeah.
Exactly. Huge economic dislocation of women in employment where we had made so much progress. So a real risk of backsliding there.
Oh, it's not just a risk. It's already happened. Yes, this is not, I'm not an economic expert. I'm not a government functionary. So some assistance has been provided by the government, but enough, row of question marks. So I think more recognition for the crucial part that those jobs play in the economy. Like, what would you do if there were nobody in the grocery store?
Stocking the shelves or
just, checking you out.
Running the cash.
Just there, keeping the store open. What would you do if there were no nurses? Like, none. What would you do if there were no assisted living care workers? So these are crucial jobs, but they're often undervalued because caring jobs in our society are undervalued.
Well, I think you've given us a lot to think about.
But the big problem is the climate crisis. And unless we solve that one, and particularly unless we solve the coming death of the oceans, all of these other questions are going to be irrelevant because we will stop breathing. I'll leave you with that thought.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about, and issues of agency, of engagement, and of inequality. Very important themes, I think, for us to pick up as we go forward in this conversation around what happens in life after the pandemic, when we go back to solving the problems like the future of the planet. So thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for being part of this event.
Bye-bye.
Nice to see you. Okay.
Nice to see you. Good luck.
Okay. Thank you. For the second part of our program today, I am really pleased to introduce our guest of honor, the Honorable Karina Gould, Minister of International Development of Canada. Il me fait un grand plaisir de vous présenter notre invitée d'honneur, l'honorable Karina Gould, Ministre de Développement International du Canada. A graduate of McGill University and the University of Oxford, Minister Gould is passionate about public service and international development. Before her election as the Member of Parliament for Burlington in 2015, she worked as a trade and investment specialist for the Mexican Trade Commission in Toronto, a consultant for the Migration and Development Program at the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C., and spent a year volunteering at an orphanage in Mexico. Of particular note is the fact that with the birth of her son, Oliver, Minister Gould became the first federal cabinet minister to have a baby while holding cabinet office. She's passionate about breaking down barriers for women, youth, and underrepresented groups. Minister, bonjour. We are thrilled to have you with us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Janice. I'm so excited to be here with you and with all of these amazing women on this panel. So I think that really they're the guests of honor because they all have incredible stories themselves. So I'm really delighted to be here.
So this is for me to jump in here and to thank all of you, Minister Carolyn, Dr. Augustine, Maryam and Nivaal, for joining us for this really fascinating discussion. There's so many questions that have been raised by your films, so many great ideas. But I wanted to start with you, Carolyn, if that's okay. You mentioned some really shocking statistics that women account for just under 40% of the global workforce, but have accounted for 50% of job losses through the pandemic. And not just women, but young people, recent immigrants, members of a BIPOC community, that's BAME to British audiences. And my question for you is, why is a feminist approach to an economic recovery really crucial? And what do we actually mean by this? What will make recovery distinctly feminist? And what will stop it just being business as usual? How do we make sure no one gets left behind?
Well, I first want to thank everybody for inviting me to this panel, because it's a real pleasure to be with this group. And I think your question starts at the right place. What do we mean by build back better from a feminist perspective? And I think it's pretty simple. It's really just believing that economic growth in and of itself is not a success if it's not shared, or if we're leaving an environment for our children that we wouldn't want to live in. And it also means putting a lens on public policy decisions that takes into account gender impacts on different groups that have more challenges than others, just because we realize that private markets don't always deliver. And I think that there's some real tangible opportunities and examples there. Quebec, for example, was a pioneer in implementing decades ago public daycare, and that resulted in women's labor force participation being pretty much the same as men. So that shocking number of 40% globally is much higher in Quebec. And I think what will make this recovery distinctly feminist is also pretty simple, in the sense that we're going to pull together, where men and women of all stripes are at the table to seize the opportunities to make sure that no one's left behind, and to make sure that we manage the transition to a low carbon environment properly. And I don't think that this is all about money. It's not about economic success. The stakes are a lot higher in this environment, and women, and I think society cares about it. It's about society's cohesion. It's about trust. And those are just foundational to the democratic values that the UK, Canada, and other like-minded countries believe in and hold. And so I think it's just time to seize the moment.
That's a really fantastic response, Carolyn. I think that example of Quebec and childcare, this kind of age-old question of childcare, child rearing, where the responsibility lies, and actually that when you solve that problem, which is not insurmountable, you actually kind of change things, across all of society. I mean, that's just a fantastic example of how a kind of feminist sort of comeback actually helps everybody and raises everybody up. So thank you so much. Now I wanted to turn to our twin activists, Maryam and Nivaal. You emphasized earlier that the kind of interconnectedness of gender inequalities with issues like the climate crisis and healthcare. And that's, of course, incredibly important when we're thinking about the impacts of COVID-19. And in addition to empowering women economically, you've spoke very passionately about the power of education for girls, something which Margaret Atwood also touched on in her interview with High Commissioner Charette. And this is something, of course, that Canada and the UK have in common, really committed to helping women and girls around the world access education. In fact, in this year of the G7 presidency, the UK is planning to host a high-level summit with Kenya to lead the global action to educate every child. I'd be really interested to hear from you. I'm sure everybody would. What you see the role is of education in crisis recovery, particularly in light of COVID.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for that question. First of all, we'd like to highlight that education is important in crises and in regular times when there aren't this many conflicts going on. And so girls play such an important part in transforming their communities. And when they are educated, they're able to make stronger decisions about their lives. They're able to make well-educated decisions about their families and transform their communities in really positive ways. And so that is just like a given. And that's something that we've seen regularly as well. But in crisis situations, it becomes even more important, because women and girls, when they are educated, they're able to transform their communities in positive ways within that crisis situation as well. So when it comes to solutions or how to take care of their families or, improve their communities as well, that progress still needs to continue despite the crises that we're in. And also, like when we see in crises like COVID-19, a lot of girls have been taken out of school. And so we can't let this crisis push back all the progress that has been made. And unfortunately, what we have seen is that it has kind of pushed back all of the progress that has been made for girls' education. And so now more than ever, we need governments to step up and make systemic and changes all around the world with how education is being dealt with. We can't return to the normal that was before the pandemic. We need to take even more tangible actions. We need to be taking actions that ensure that all girls are getting access to quality education and that they're prepared to become the leaders of their communities, which they truly are already, but with an education, they're much better equipped to be able to do that. So these are just some of the ways in which we believe that girls can play such a huge role in transforming their communities and having a positive impact in all of society. When one girl is educated, you see the impacts of that throughout not only the community in which they live, but also the society in which they live. And these are things that have been well researched. The impacts of girls' education are profound, and we believe that it truly has an impact with all of the other goals that we have in mind, whether it's in terms of healthcare or climate change. Once girls are educated, they're the ones who are going to be leading these efforts. And once they're educated, then they can, do that in a much more, in a much more effective way. So yeah, that's why we believe that girls' education is so vital as we return, post COVID-19, but also just in regular times as well.
That's really fascinating and very powerful. And this kind of point again that, by raising up women, by raising up girls, you're actually raising up everybody. So this is a kind of win-win, and also just the kind of horrific, the horrific waste of resource, the waste of talent if we don't do this, that this would be a kind of total tragedy. So I want to turn to you now, Minister, because I can sort of see this thread emerging in all of these discussions with these wonderful speakers, and that is this emphasis on a kind of interconnectedness of the issues and of the injustices. That is that we're seeing the pandemic affect women and girls most especially, and in addition to, especially marginalized individuals due to factors like quality of healthcare, socioeconomic issues and access to jobs, access to vaccines, education. And I know that you've spoken very much in the past about the importance of ensuring access to education for children affected by humanitarian and natural disasters or armed conflict, forced displacement. So it would be really great to know from you, why is feminist leadership crucial to achieving education for all, especially in young girls? And what do governments need to do to ensure change?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And maybe I'll just start by a reflection that I had upon seeing all of the videos, is that we talk a lot about the cost of doing things, but we don't talk enough about the cost of not doing some things. And we don't talk enough about the cost of inequality and power imbalances. And so I think, for me, why rebuilding, because I never want to build back, right? We want to go forwards. And I think we need to think about, what does it look like as we're moving forward? What's the kind of society that we want to see in a feminist way is so crucial and so important, because it's about inclusion, and it's about really ensuring that people have an equity of access when it comes to opportunities. And so when I think about the importance of education, and the importance of education, particularly for girls, but for children, in conflict situations, it really is about making sure that they still have the opportunity to pursue their dreams, and they still have the opportunity to dream as well. I had this beautiful conversation with members of my Refugee Education Council who were talking about education as hope. We've gotten pretty good at making sure that marginalized and displaced people have access to food, that they have access to shelter. We still have more work to do to make sure that quality is there, but we have a long way to go when it comes to access to education. And so we can nourish their bodies, but we also have to nourish their spirits and their minds. And so this is really about ensuring those opportunities. And I think, Polly, as you said, it's a human tragedy when we're losing out on the potential of people around the world because of the circumstances that they find themselves in. And there is a tremendous opportunity and benefit to all of us to make those investments to ensure that, you know, children, no matter where they are, no matter what their circumstances, have access to a quality education and then opportunities thereafter. You know, I think that we have a lot to learn in the global north or west, so to speak, from people in other places around the world. It's not just about us telling them what they need to do. It's about listening to them and understanding where they find themselves and what the barriers are that they're facing, and then how we can work with them alongside them to help address those and to break those down. And I think for governments like Canada and the UK, I mean, we've been working so hard on access to education for girls' education, starting with the Charlevoix initiative, and now with, you know, the UK's presidency of the G7. I know that's going to take on, again, such an important role, and the Together for Learning campaign that we've launched in Canada. And so it's about working with partners around the world to say, this is actually an investment that's worth making because there's a cost to not doing it. Right? There's a physical, emotional, moral cost, but there's actually a dollar cost associated with it as well. And so let's reframe the discussion and let's think about what that means for all of us to be successful in that kind of society that we can envision, and what we're going to gain, all of us, from making those investments.
I'm so sort of heartened to hear you speak like this and speak in these terms. And I think this kind of idea of a fully realized life, you know, the right to dream, the right to hope, not just the right just to have a house. And, you know, those things are important. Food is important, but actually to live a full life, that is so important. And also, it seems to me that this way that you're framing feminism as something which is inclusive, that has to take people with you. It's not just about individuals being empowered. It's actually about, you have to share that and work with other people. And I think that's just such a kind of, it's sort of what I've got from all of the films that everybody's made and the conversations we're having. And it seems like a really good point here to turn to Dr. Augustine, because you spoke very powerfully and movingly about intersectionality. And I'm really curious to know what having an intersectional understanding means in practice, in terms of solving these really entrenched problems of power structures and values. And how does an intersectional approach to these issues change power relations to benefit everyone? And how can we as individuals act to build a more inclusive world? Because sometimes it feels very overwhelming for individuals. And you're a role model as an individual who's done such amazing things. So it'd be wonderful to have some of your insights.
Thank you, Polly, and thank you for the question. I think it's important in any discussion around feminist leadership and going forward that we recognize the situation of women in every sphere of endeavor. So we have to see race, we have to see immigrant status, we have to see age. So for example, when I talk about intersectionality or intersections, I say I'm usually caught at several intersections. The intersection of being a senior, being a Black woman, being an immigrant woman to Canada, being a Catholic woman. There are so many intersections. And those have to be taken into consideration as we plan, as we do policy work, and as we provide leadership going forward, that we include this. For example, depending on what the let's take the intersection of immigrant women. In Canada, where are they found on the employment frame? You take the issue of violence against women. Where is that issue? And at what intersection do we address that issue? When we look at rates of pay or childcare or any factor that we look at, where And how do we address this depending on what the intersection is? And so for me, the issue of women and poverty, that is really very, very high in Canada. Poor women, immigrant women, senior women, all of those intersections that I cross, those are women that in any discussion and in any policy direction as we move forward, that we have to address those issues. Otherwise, we marginalize those groups in that intersection, and we make progress for some, and we leave others behind. But if we are to move and we are to make a difference in the society, and if we are to build the kind of society where we talk about equality and justice and fairness and all of those things, it's important for us to recognize the issue of intersectionality. Who are we planning for? And how do we assist those in the margins to move along with us to the center and forward?
That is, I love that sort of moving from the margins to move to the center and forward. It's so powerful. Thank you. I've got one last question for the minister. I'd love to know, what does the post-COVID future look like for you? And how can Canada and the UK work together to achieve that vision?
Good question.
It is a good question. And I maybe just want to build off of something that Dr. Augustine was talking about in terms of making sure it's a future where everyone is included. And I think that's something that I've been doing a lot of thinking about, and certainly my colleagues have been thinking about as well, is how do we really close those gaps that have actually been there the whole time, we just haven't really been looking at. And I think that's what COVID is asking us and requiring of us, is saying there are certain things in society that actually are essential that we really don't value very much. And I think a lot about care and care work, whether that's childcare, whether that's elder care, whether that's caring for someone who's ill. And the burden of care work often falls on women. And we do not recognize or value that enough. And you know, what Carolyn was talking about in terms of seeing job losses amongst women at at such high numbers. Well, because a lot of those women are either working in sectors that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, or they have to take time off because children aren't in school. They maybe have an elderly parent at home for whom it's harder to care for now. Maybe they, are the primary caregiver for someone who is in a long-term care facility. There are so many issues, and I'm not saying men don't provide care either, but it's much greater for women. And whether it's paid or unpaid, we do not value it in the way that we should. And I hope that what we are seeing with COVID-19 is that actually we need to do more, and we need to ensure that people in Canada, in the UK, around the world have the supports that they need to provide that care, but also so that, we're not holding women back, because we're saying not only, do you have to go out and have paid work, but you're also responsible for all of those unpaid care activities as well. And so for me, whether it's domestic or international policies, we cannot move forward without looking at paid and unpaid care. And we cannot move forward without applying that intersectional lens. And, feminism for me is not just about women. Feminism, as Dr. Augustine so beautifully said in her previous conversation, is about addressing power imbalances. That's what it's about. It's about recognizing structures of power and how they keep some people in and push some people out. And so when we're thinking about our feminist international assistance policy in Canada, or talking about what it means to be a feminist government, we have to apply that intersectional lens, and we have to figure out how we're addressing those power imbalances so that we're not pulling people down, we're bringing everybody up. And that's ultimately the objective. And so for me, when we talk about rebuilding feminist, how are we taking those lessons that we've seen so clearly and starkly illustrated because of COVID-19 that have been there the whole time and saying, okay, enough. We need to fix these, and we cannot accept them any longer. So that's what we have to work on.
That's, you know, that again is really powerful. And I think this point about care work, which also, you know, Margaret Atwood in her interview, she brought up as well, that it's been kind of historically totally undervalued. And of course, COVID has just shone a light on the fact that care work is, you know, vital work. You know, that society falls apart without care workers, whether that's in the home or in, you know, looking after the elderly, whatever, nursing. This care work is absolutely essential. So I guess my question really, and I'm sort of opening this out now to the panel because I think everybody can contribute here, is, you know, how do we make sure that those roles are valued? And I do mean that economically valued, because that is important, but that they're valued in terms of status, that they're seen as being important, that they're central to actually a functioning, healthy society. What do we do to make sure that that happens? I'm going to give that to the minister.
I'll go very quickly, and then everyone else can jump in after that. Right. I think we pay care workers appropriately and adequately and recognize the value of their work. I think that's really important because a lot of care workers are women. They're low-wage workers, and you know, it keeps them in poverty, quite frankly, right? So we need to pay a living wage and a good wage, and recognize the work that they're doing. I mean, you know, whether it's you know, an early learning and childcare provider who, you know, we are trusting with the future of, you know, of our world, right? But that's a valuable thing to pay for, whether it's caring for someone who's elderly and requires, you know, that support. We need to pay them adequately because we need them actually for a functioning society, and we need to value them accordingly. And then the other thing that I would say is that we need to recognize this is not a women's issue, right? This is a society issue. Women's issues are not just for women, right? They are for everybody, and we are all impacted by it. And this maybe goes again to the point that I think Carolyn was making about there's a cost to inequality. There's a cost to not doing these things. And so, you know, we have to reassess what our cost benefit analysis is. And so I think for me, those are two important points. There's a lot more, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I wanted to open up the discussion in this way as well, because Minister, you alluded to that, in fact, we don't want to go back. We don't want to go back to what was pre-COVID, because all COVID has done is just kind of shine a light on the inequalities which existed that need to be challenged and changed. And actually, we want to build forward into a future. And so I'd love to ask you all, you know, what does that future look like? I mean, why not the twins? Maybe you could have a look. You've got the most, in a sense, invested in the future because you're the youngest. So what does the future look like for you that is kind of feminist and positive and feminist in this inclusive sense rather than just for women, you know, this idea of it being for everyone?
Absolutely. I think one of the main things is when we're going towards this future, just being really radical about the ways that we think of possibilities. And so being brave enough to think about systematic changes, and like if there's a structural change that needs to happen, how are we going to make that happen versus, you know, like let's have this short-term project that will work within, you know, this like the next 5 years or so, but what are we thinking about for the next 30 years, or what are the possibilities for the next 40, 50 years, and what does that look like? And so I think as youth, as young people, and like adults as well, but I think especially youth, we see these possibilities as like obvious and changes that like you can do this and you can make this happen, but and then when you come into the real world, quote unquote real world, it's like, you know, there's like these barriers and we can't really create these system changes or structural changes. But I think it is a possibility, and COVID-19 really has shown that with like, you know, climate change and everything, for example. a lot of people say it's too hard, we can't make these types of changes that quickly. But yes, you can, and COVID-19 has shown that too. These quick changes, policy changes can happen once we have this urgency associated with them.
I think what we've all agreed on around the table from these different perspectives is this point that actually you have to have diverse voices at the table. We have to have this broad discussion. And also what I love that you've just brought up is, I've just done this exhibition at the British Library on the history of women's rights in the UK. And, what that has shown me is that change is not easy. It doesn't just happen inevitably. It happens because people fight for it, because they push for it, because they care about it. And also because, terrible things like a pandemic happen and they force change, but they show you that change is possible. And I think the discussions that we've had today and that your fantastic expertise across this panel has shown us that, there's so much to play for, there's so much that needs to change, but that it can be done and that it will be done. And I just wish all of you were totally in charge of the world. That would be my plan for the future.
We'll find new solutions to age-old problems.
Yes, I would love to just give the final word to the Minister. I know you have to go very soon, but if you have a final word, Minister, because it's been such a pleasure to have you here.
Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, everyone has just added so much to this conversation, and I feel really privileged to have been part of it. And if I can just say, like, all four of you, have energized me, right? Because I think, what you were talking about, Maryam and Nivaal, about being really bold and brave, in pushing forward. That's why young voices matter, because you see the potential, you see what we can achieve, and you need to keep pushing us to work for that. And then, with Dr. Augustine, all the trailblazing and just, incredible achievements that you have, it's such a privilege to be on this panel with you and to continue to learn from you, right? And, the changes that you've been able to lead in our society, and just to keep, working on that is really wonderful. And Carolyn, bringing that, feminist approach to the work that you do within finance, right? And within the private sector. And I think showing that everyone, no matter which part of society you're in, has a role to play. And anyways, I'm feeling super inspired by this conversation. And a happy International Women's Day to everyone. Thank you so much, Janice, for inviting me to be part of this. And thank you everyone for having this great conversation. It's awesome.
Well, thank you. And thank all of our speakers. Just fantastic. What a wonderful, wonderful event. And again, yep, I too am totally inspired. I'm sure everybody is that's watching it. Thank you so much.